Good morning and welcome everybody, or good afternoon. Welcome everybody. This is John May.
And this is Fran Plaisted. And while John is going to pull up our slideshow, we're going to go over the basics of Voc Rehab along with the basics and beyonds. There's a couple of changes we're going to talk about this year that we haven't talked about in the past. And some of the information is probably a little bit familiar if you've heard the talk before. So John, do you want to start with?
Sure. So the first thing is, what is vocational rehabilitation? And vocational rehabilitation, a working definition is any service that will enable a person with a disability to function in a vocational context. So typically in workers' comp, the disability stems from an injury, and we receive a referral from an adjuster, sometimes from an attorney, and we're going to assess what services are required to restore someone to suitable employment. So the counselor's goal is to coordinate services to match the person's abilities to the demands of the job. So in other words, when someone has an injury, their function diminishes and the job's requirements are greater than they're capable of performing. So our job is to work with you either to improve that person's level of function so that they can perform that job, or change that job somehow, or find a new job that they can perform. So there is both an art and a science to vocational rehabilitation, but the range of services is pretty standard. Services may include job placement, reasonable accommodation, negotiation of on-the-job training agreements, collaboration with other agencies, or a skill training. So the goal of this presentation is to kind of familiarize you or update you on what to look for and in workers' comp and Voc Rehab and workers' comp in Vermont, and to identify strategies to improve the quality and efficiency of vocational rehabilitation for your injured workers.
Right. So the process starts with a screening. And not all cases do you have to do a screening on, and there's a new hearing decision I'm going to go over on that. But basically, when an individual has been out of work for 90 days or longer, the insurance carrier is required to do a screening. At that point in time, the client is also sent a letter and they respond saying they're interested or they're not interested. If they're not, then the carrier's contact to do a screening. So this new hearing decision, which was Armstrong versus the Norwich University, indicated that prior to this hearing decision, a VR8 could be filed after 90 days out of work, and then the client and the counselor, the counselor that was assigned would start services. But based on this new hearing decision, the carrier should be aware that, and all parties should really be aware that if a VR8 is filed and there's no counselor on the file, then the Department of Labor, everyone will, then the carrier is then given an opportunity to send the case to for a screening. So that means that, so let's just say I got a VR8 and before I can go out and do any services, I'm notified by Trudy that, that a screening was not done on the case. They then contact the carrier. The carrier then sends the information to the state to do the screening. And I'll go through the screening process so that the carrier, if the screening comes back and the person, they feel that, we'll go through the criterion, but if there's no criterion, if the criterion's not met, then the case, the VR8 is not taken to services. So even after the screening, if the screening comes back and they recommend Voc Rehab services, the carrier can then also select a Voc Rehab counselor. Although if a VR8 has been filed, it's likely going to be filed again, but that's the protocol. The screening has to be done by a qualified Voc Rehab professional from the Division of Voc Rehab. So what happens is the carrier sends the information to the screening coordinator. The screening coordinator then, based on the geographic area, assigns the case to a counselor in that area who then has a 3-point contact. So you want to be sure you send your medical records, specifically in regarding to their work capacity. Then they're going to look at the medical records. They're going to then contact the employer, and they're going to contact the client. They're going to contact the employer to see if there's, transitional work, if the employer is planning to take the individual back to work, and then they're going to contact the client to see, where the client stands in the process. And the goal of the screening initially was to be sure that someone that has a fractured ankle that's likely going to get better, and he was a truck driver and he's going to be able to return to a truck driver, there's probably no reason to do an entitlement assessment, but it might take longer than 90 days for that individual to improve, so that, in the screening that, they can make a decision and say, okay, they've been out of work for 90 days. We think they're going to go back to work. So the screener can then make a couple of different, they can say they don't need voc rehab. They can say they need to revisit voc rehab. And then, they can recommend voc rehab be referred to at that time. So
I think the big takeaway here is that you have the right of first referral on voc rehab, okay? And you don't necessarily have to make a referral for a screening. If you determine that, because of the nature of the injury or the employer or the job, that the person is likely to require voc rehab, you're much, much better off sending that voc rehab referral out early. Now, I know that sounds like self-aggrandizing for voc rehab counselors, but there's a lot of data, and we'll get into that later, but there's a lot of data that supports early referral as a manager of costs. Now, obviously, you've had experiences with good voc rehab and with bad voc rehab. And we can talk to you a little bit, we will talk to you a little bit about how you can oversee voc rehab to ensure you're getting quality services. But the data is pretty clear that early referral tends to generate better outcomes.
Right. And along those lines, if the client has an attorney involved in the case, this is the perfect opportunity before the screening process or the referral process takes place. And John's going to go over the referral, would be to contact the attorney and agree upon a voc rehab counselor that you both find amenable to meeting your needs. So that way, you don't pay for any duplication of services, because once a counselor gets the case, they have to do this initial interview. And then there's, usually the first report, there's a significant cost associated with that. So if you have to do 2 of those, it costs you more. So John's going to cover the VR1.
So as I said, the carrier has the right of first referral. So this is really where you have the most control over how the vocational rehabilitation process is going to go. If there is an attorney, as Fran said, and you can agree on a counselor, then that's usually the best way to forestall any future change in counselors, which can end up in duplicating services and costing you more money. So if everybody's in agreement on the voc rehab counselor, that's usually the best approach. And if you don't know voc rehab counselors, I know there are agreements, vendor agreements and contracts and so forth, but we would encourage you to get to know the voc rehab counselors in the state of Vermont. There aren't that many of us, and you can determine the quality of the services based on your experience or other adjusters' experience with those counselors. The longer it takes an employee to return to work, the lower the likelihood the employee will return to work, with an even lower likelihood that their employee will return to a comparable wage. And I have some data on that later. But this is really important that you get the referral out in a timely manner. That is, at 90 days, this is supposed to go out. It can go out sooner than that. If someone is date of disability, that is the date when they've been out of work, occurred 90 days ago, it's mandatory that a referral for voc rehab be processed. And again, you can send it out sooner if you feel that voc rehab is going to be relevant in a particular case.
Right. And particularly if you're catastrophic, it's not a bad idea to start on the cases early, so that also keeping that person employed. I mean, sometimes I think on a case, like I have a case right now where I haven't even filed an entitlement assessment, but I've already met with the employer, the client's already back working 2 hours a day, 3 days a week. And that right there, and this is a pretty catastrophic injury, means more likely, we're going to really keep building on that, the hours he's working and all the rest. So the early referral for job modifications, transitional work is can be very beneficial to the carrier and the client.
I think just one other note there is when there's an early referral like that, that allows the counselor to establish a rapport with that injured worker. And as you are probably aware, some folks feel like they're out on an island with nobody maintaining contact with them. They start to get resentful towards you, towards their employer, towards their providers. And we can kind of act as the liaison to maintain a positive relationship in the return to work process.
Right. So after the counselor receives the file, the first thing that has to be addressed is an entitlement assessment. Basically, the entitlement assessment is a determination that the voc rehab counselor makes of whether someone can return to work that they have prior training and experience to perform. So often the lower the wages, the lower the skill level, the less likely they're going to be entitled to services. The higher the wages, the higher the skill level. The skill level can vary, but if you have somebody earning $1,000 a week, even if they're a skilled individual, sometimes they're going to be entitled to services. In the entitlement process, the counselor has to have access to the medical records, at least all of the records that address the work capacity and the prognosis, because what we're really looking for is you're trying to see if they can perform work which they have previous training or experience. So you need to know what they cannot do, and what they can do. So if they cannot go back to work as a carpenter and that, then you can start the process of moving forward in the voc rehab process. If you get the case and you're not sure, John's going to go through the suspension and extension. But if you have a carpenter and they have a significant low back injury, they're more likely than not going to get a light duty work capacity, and they're going to be entitled to services. But if you have like a carpenter who was working as an accounting or a bookkeeping clerk, and the wages are comparable, then they might not be entitled to voc rehab services, and you would file them as not entitled. So in the entitlement assessment, you want to look for a medical summary. You want to be sure that the counselor has established whether or not the employer can take them back to work. Sometimes it's pretty obvious they've relocated, the employer's closed, the employer only has heavy work. So the counselor should address that issue. And then you're going to want them to look at their education and work history in that. So in some situations where we're not sure a client, but that we see that they don't have like a high school education, we might want to address that lack of a high school education, so that in the event that they cannot go back to work with the insured, that they are, at least have a high school education. So, and you should look for a skills analysis, which is a little different than a transferable skills analysis. You're looking at specifically their skills, not what transfers to other occupations, but you're looking to see if they have computer skills, if they have communication skills, if they're good woodworkers, can they read blueprints? Can they, those are the types of things you're looking at. You're not looking at, oh, I think they could be an engineer, even though they were a carpenter. We're just looking specifically at the skills. We also may look at the labor market. So if you have a case where it's a little bit on the fence, where, let's just say an individual is earning like $15 an hour, and that's pretty much close to the average wage in the state. So you might say, there's so many jobs now at 15. I think that they could get a job. So the counselor might actually do a little bit of labor market research to back up their argument, saying like, yeah, they're not entitled because there's 25 jobs, where he could earn, $15, even though he doesn't have directly transferable, they're unskilled jobs, he can pick them up right away. So that's what you're sort of looking at.
So it's not necessary that a labor market survey be conducted on every case, but on those cases where there's some question or uncertainty, it's helpful, because then we can establish whether that person's going to be able to return to another type of job, making a comparable wage. And we're going to talk later a little bit about the implications of COVID and the number of remote work jobs that have become available and how the labor market has sort of changed, even in Vermont. So the next step in this process, it doesn't always happen, but is extension and suspension.
Right.
So this is
right.
this is a form VR5. We file these when we close a case, but we may also file a suspension if no active vocational rehabilitation services are expected to take place. So in other words, if somebody is having surgery and their medical treatment does not allow them to engage in any kind of vocational rehabilitation, then we're going to suspend it for a fixed period of time. There should be minimal billing during a suspension period. The counselor should be in touch with you and perhaps the client in order to access medical information, to affirm the timeline for reinitiating vocational rehabilitation. But there shouldn't be any active job development and placement.
No meetings.
No meetings, nothing like that. Now, an extension is slightly different. It's where, oh, gee, you know, the person's entitled. We haven't been able to identify a goal. Maybe we need to do a little work. We're going to extend it in order to set a timeline that's realistic for identifying a goal and developing a plan. Or occasionally we may provide some kind of informal services, such as what Fran was talking about. Maybe they just need to get their GED, and maybe we're going to work on that first before we write up a full plan. If there's not enough information to determine entitlement, we may extend it for a period of time until we get a work capacity. And typically this is going to be a shorter time frame. You know, if somebody's having a lumbar fusion, multi-level lumbar fusion, that might be several months of suspension. But if we're just waiting on them to get a functional capacity evaluation, the extension should maybe be 60 days so that we can review that, work with the person, identify a goal, and move on to the next step. But if there, you know, you can request an extension if those issues aren't resolved within the time frame you establish. But you know, that is the distinction. During an extension, there can be some meetings or some voc rehab involvement, not to the extent that we would see usually when we're working closely with someone. But during a suspension, there should not be any active meetings or significant work being done.
Right. So once an individual is found entitled, then the counselor begins the process of developing, we call it a return to work plan in the state of Vermont. And this is a plan that is initially developed with the counselor and the client, but the carrier has a significant role in that. And the carrier has, the process is supposed to be a collaboration of all parties. You should, if you haven't, after an entitlement assessment is done, you might want to reach out to the counselor and say, where are you going with this case? What are you looking at? And take a look at things before, you know, things go along. But the counselor should also be doing the same. I mean, you'll be getting your 30-day status reports, but you may also have some questions. And the counselor is required before the plan, if the carrier doesn't approve the plan, the counselor is required to offer a phone conference with the client, the carrier, and all parties. So just remember that if a plan comes and you're like, whoa, this is out of league with what I was thinking was going to happen, you would have that alternative. But let me go through the nuts and bolts of the plan. So the first thing you'll see is a vocational goal, and that should be specific. So unless it's a preliminary plan where you know you're trying to address some significant gaps that, you know, some work development skills that an individual has, the VR goal should be a specific occupation or occupation. So you might say, okay, I'm going to do a certification as a bookkeeping/accounting clerk, but it should be very specific. It shouldn't just be, oh, I'm going to let them learn how to do more math, and we're going to go into a whole bunch of different occupations. The specific would be important.
Right. You may list, like the counselor may list financial administrative clerk, you know, or a clerical goal. So it might be a range of occupations if you're doing that kind of, if you're not set on a goal, but it should be, there should at least be some direction that's very clear in the goal.
Right. And so the first, after you see the vocational goal, what you should be looking for is the return to work priority. And that's sort of like the hierarchy of services in Vermont. So obviously, the first service is trying to get them back to the insured. And I myself like to write plans and sort of address how I've looked at each of these levels. So, all right, let's just say I have the carpenter, he can't go back to work with the insured. We've looked at on-the-job training, that's not an option, but I found that if he gets, some CAD training, somebody down the road is willing to give him a job. So then, I might write a plan for training, but the first plan might be, okay, he's a carpenter. Let's just see what's out there in the job market. So you might start with job placement services. But I would address why I've selected that level and what services I would provide at that level. You should almost always see that job placement is included in that. So unless everyone agrees, even if you do like a short-term retraining, they're going to then eventually need to go to job placement. I think, and the last one, which we never write, is self-employment. Although once in a blue moon, we might write a self-employment for somebody where there's nothing else we can do. But that's something we don't really see that often. We also don't see a tremendous amount of on-the-job trainings any longer. Actually, since I've been doing this, I've hardly seen any. But I am seeing more work experience and internships. And so I think that might be an avenue we, look at more, is if you do have somebody they can learn a little bit in a classroom, like a plumber or an electrician's a perfect example, is, they get work experience on the job, and then there's some classroom training outside of work. So you might see somebody including like an internship, in a plan, and that's a really good path to go down. Okay, so then after the hierarchy of services, you're going to have a completion date, and then you're going to be looking for the rationale. And this should be pretty significant. This should address what's going on medically, why they can't go back to work, what in occupations that they've done previously, and why the services are required. So it shouldn't be, and you should also see where they're going to go with the services, what kind of wages they're going to make. I mean, you should see, it should be a pretty comprehensive few paragraphs of covering a lot of details. So it shouldn't be like, couldn't get them a job, it should have some detail to it. So you should have a clear understanding when you read that, even if you know the file, even if you don't know the file, you should be able to pick that up and say like, oh, he had a herniated disc and he can't be a car, you should be able to get all of the details from that. And then we come down to the nuts and bolts. So we're going to establish some objectives. And obviously the first objective is to return to some type of suitable employment. So, job placement, even if they're not released to work, I often have an objective with job placement. And what I put in there is pending a work release, we're going to engage in job placement, even if it's for transitional work, because having somebody working is always better for the individual and for the carrier. Then I might have the second and third objectives, and might be, providing them with the training, and this is what they're going to do. And then they're going to go to suitable employment afterwards. And then you'll see the cost. I actually do the cost. If there's any detail to the cost, I put that in my all of the details of the plan, but I also again outline it in the end. And then the last one is the responsibilities. And you really should take a look at, the responsibilities and provide feedback. If you think that they're not specific enough, then certainly, offer, that suggestion that, you want more details. What is the client responsible for doing in that, so I think, and then the carrier's responsibilities, you have your own. So take a look at those and make sure that you're okay with what you're responsible for. I mean, typically the carrier the individual has to pay the funds. Anyways, we'll go on to the next one.
This is boilerplate language for the claimant's understanding, but that's relevant. If somebody doesn't pass a class or something, I mean, either it's a failure on the part of the VR counselor to assess the case properly, or it's a failure on the part of the person to fulfill their obligations.
Right. And there should be, if they are going to school, they need to maintain a passing grade point average. So you want to see those kinds of languages in every plan, so that, if they're getting more than one class, that if they don't pass one class, then, you don't want to be on the hook for continuing to pay for classes for an individual. You want to see them putting forth an effort. So,
So here is the hierarchy of services.
right. I think,
And this is standard across most jurisdictions, right? Each level must be considered. And as Fran said, a good VR counselor is going to put into the plan how each level was addressed before moving on to the next level. And if you feel that a level was skipped or not addressed thoroughly, and that includes active engagement by the injured worker. So if there's job placement to be done, it shouldn't just be the counselor doing research. The client needs to demonstrate that they have conducted research and applied for jobs and so forth. So each level of the service should be addressed.
right. And I just have one more pointer on that. And that's, so when you see a plan and someone says, oh, for, this occupation, they're required to get a 2-year associate's degree, you want to be sure that they've looked at the new skill training and retraining. The vocational technical programs in the state of Vermont offer a huge array of courses and training programs. And, there's many ways to reach your goal. And what as the counselor we're supposed to do is we're supposed to look for the most efficient, cost-effective way to reach the goal. So let's just say, you've selected a job like phlebotomist, and and some of this stuff is gimmicky. So as the counselor, you want to get rid of any sort of, you want to be sure any training you pursue has good, credentials, and will offer them the right certification so they can gain employment. That all happens in the research that they do. But if you think a plan is excessive, like, you're like, why are we doing a 2-year training program when, this individual has a medium work capacity and I think he could get, a CDL in like 3 months, so you have every reason to have, to bring up those issues. And we're going to get into how you can address that later on. But to begin with, you might, start by saying, why didn't you look for certification programs? Why didn't you look at the VOTEC programs?
And by the way, if anybody has watched the news or about the labor market in Vermont, there is a tremendous need right now for truck drivers. So those kinds of short-term training programs are really a good option. And a lot of this, what we've discovered through the pandemic is that clients, for the most part, nearly, I would say most clients need technology and skills to interact with the world of work, okay? So that means not just if they're doing some training, they need it in order to conduct a job search, to apply for jobs. Most employers aren't, they respond more to an emailed application or letter and resume than they do to one that is sent through the regular mail. In fact, most don't even list their addresses anymore in the job postings.
Right.
And
most applications are completely online now. Completely online. So.
And the other thing is that we can provide some VR services virtually. We've discovered that if a client has tech skills, and let's say I'm just doing a job search and showing them how to use Indeed and to document that, that may be something where for some people I might have to go in person, but for other folks I might be able to just say, well, let's take a look at it on, and I can do it through a Zoom call. And there are other things that can be done virtually. But I think there are many other needs that are met by ensuring that injured workers have access to technology. Many of our folks are blue collar workers, maybe older, and maybe they have very few skills in using a computer. But what we found is that through the pandemic and even after the pandemic, that many appointments are being held through telemed. People require access to computer skills so that they can maintain contact with their families. And certainly they need it for any kind of skill development. And there are a lot of training programs that are out there. There are free universal online classes available through the Department of Libraries. A lot of times I will, if someone has an interest in a very skilled medical field, I might say, okay, take a medical terminology class for free, and then I'll see if they're truly motivated, they'll do that. And some people are, and some people kind of drag their feet, and then I might say, gee, let's see where things are going before we invest any money in that.
Right.
Now, post-pandemic, some resources are open, the career centers are open, and I encourage you and the counselors you work with to access services through the career centers. And they also have online workshops in resume development, job development, interviewing. There will be some job fairs. There haven't been too many, but there are some. And in-person training there's more of that than there was.
Right.
And in the fall, in all likelihood, academic programs will have some kind of hybrid of in-person and online. So you're going to see that the plans are going to incorporate online resources, and many will include the cost of a computer. Typically, you can get a decent computer, good enough for participating in any academic program or conducting job search, for $350 or less. Okay, I think if you can get a refurbished computer, there's a lot of those out there, and you can get them for even significantly cheaper than that.
Right, but even at Best Buy, once we have more computers, but there are the access to computers is, and I want to just point out one thing as John went through that. If you ever think about filling out a complete job application on your cell phone, that's what we're up against if we don't provide them with a computer. They try to use proper capitalizations and proper grammar, but it's very difficult. Whereas if they have a computer and access to one, then you can, even if they have to fill out an application, they can cut and paste from the resume that we've done, so they can paste in the job description and we can show them all that. And then we can be sure that they're selling themselves well, versus, if they filled it out on the phone, they may have misspelled things. They certainly haven't capitalized. And many employers, that's enough to just, they would get weaned out right at the very beginning of the process. So that's something we've really learned, is that they, and then before, they had access to, there are libraries that they can go to, but, I live in a small town, and I think the library's open like 6 hours a week now. There's just not a lot of access for individuals who live rural to access a lot of the things that you would have in a city. So,
and I think it used to be the experience, I'm sure most adjusters have the experience, that the computer systems that were being requested were $1,000 or something like that. And this kind of investment, an investment of $350 or less, or in some cases, we may even just provide a loaner to help with job placement. But the other thing is, it may end up saving you money, because those people may end up working from home,
right,
because there are far more remote work opportunities as a result of the pandemic. We see that all the time, and in many cases, it's easier to get a home-based job for folks who have functional impairments than it is to find a job that's going to match up with their abilities.
right,
Because there's, a lot of times the home-based jobs have flexibility, and they're easier to coordinate. So the next thing, just real quick, the Rule 12, which is your ability to request or compel a job search from an injured worker. We believe that once the COVID restrictions were lifted, has been lifted as well. Now, that is not vocational rehabilitation. A lot of times there's some confusion. Oh, we're compelling a job search and we want Fran Plaisted to help with that. Yes, you can do that, but we don't enforce that. Our job is to restore someone to suitable work. We may help document that, help the client document their efforts, but then it's going to be up to you. If you want to file a Form 27 based on non-compliance with a job search, you're welcome to do that, and we may help if you ask us to, but that is not vocational rehabilitation. I encourage you to go to the Department of Labor website, because there are a lot more resources on there than there were pre-pandemic. Information on jobs, training opportunities, grant funding. By the way, if your counselors are not looking at grant funding opportunities through VSAC or other agencies, please encourage them to do that before they have you foot the bill for some academic program. many of these skill training programs are covered by grants because what we've seen is that there's a lot more incentive to get people involved in short-term skill training through the state of Vermont and through the federal government as well.
Right, and there's a lot of workforce development programs. So, the counselor should look at all of the different options before they come up with the plan. And I will just say this, that sometimes when you draft return to work plan, we have to put in, we suspect someone's going to receive financial assistance because of their wages, their children, et cetera. We unfortunately don't know what they're going to get because they don't know what they're going to get. So, I drafted a plan a year or so ago, and I said I thought it was going to be $15,000 total, and I think that the schooling costs ended up being like less than five. But I said, I put in there, stipulated that and I would include that in my return to work plans, that they are required to apply for all financial assistance. They're not required to take loans out, but they certainly can go to VSAC and get all the free avenue, resources that they can. So,
and anybody who's had a kid in college knows it's no picnic to fill out those FAFSA forms. They often get kickback, and so typically the counselor is going to provide some assistance. And a lot of times we work with VSAC grant coordinators as well, and they will let us know about funding that's available for different skill training programs. They run on a fiscal year calendar, so right now there's a lot of money available, but last month there was nothing left. It had all been used up for the year. So just some other things at the Department of Labor website. They have COVID updates. There's a program called Retain, which is an initiative to facilitate earlier return to work. And there's some data that they quoted on here. The longer it takes to return to work, the less chance there is of ever returning. A worker, they state, a worker who has three months of work disability has a 50% chance of returning to work. The likelihood of a worker returning to work after a year of work disability is less than 15%. And we would add to that, Fran and I have conducted research that the likelihood of returning to a comparable wage is less than 2% if someone is out of work for a year. So if you're not paying attention to these voc rehab issues and it's going on a year, the likelihood of a permanent total is that great.
Right.
So pay attention to that. Early referral is going to pay off in the long run, both in terms of maintaining good relationships with your clients and accounts, but also in terms of cost, because somebody who is engaged in the process is much more likely to return to work and much more likely to return to a comparable wage.
Right. I think whenever, as a voc rehab counselor, when we start a case, we hear a lot about an individual's medical issues. And once they start on a return to work plan, I often say to myself, like, they're no longer telling me how much their back hurts, their ankle hurts, their head hurt. I'm basically at that point, like, did you know how hard this class is? This class is so hard. I can't do this typing. But that's a sign that we're moving in the right direction for that person. And that is a great sign, because then they're no longer focused on what they can't do, which is what they've done for, and the longer they focus on what they can't do, the harder it is to convince them what they can do. So
take a look at those websites if you have the opportunity. I know you probably go on there once in a while, but when you're free, just kind of poke around, and there's a lot of really useful information.
Okay, so all of a sudden, you have a case and you're looking at it saying, why are they entitled to voc rehab services? I'm pretty sure the insured's going to take them back to work, but they only made like, $15 an hour or $10. Vermont is, the wages are higher than that, but their average weekly wage is $600. And so really, if you're sitting there saying, this just doesn't look right to me, object. The way it works is that you can get an independent vocational assessment of the situation from a private, another counselor, to say yay or nay. But if your gut feeling is that something is wrong, you need to send the objection in right away. And I would encourage you to do that, because oftentimes I see cases and a plan has been drafted and we're on to the second plan or the third plan. And then I go back and I look at the entitlement assessment. I was like, why were they ever found entitled to
Mhm.
begin with? And so it's important to read that, because you only have a minimum amount of time to respond. So when they come in, pick them up, read them, and you can object right away.
And if you called Fran or me and you said, hey, I had some questions about this, so I filed an objection, we may look at it and say, no, I think that's okay. And we may not have to file a full formal report. We may just give you an opinion that, yeah, I think that there are reasons why that person's entitled. You may want to withdraw that objection. On the other hand, if there is an objection and the person's represented and there's some controversy about it, then we may have to file a formal report. But I mean, a consult is a short call. Send me the information. I'll take a look at it. I'll give you an opinion.
Right. And the counselor that's on record might be perfectly legit in what they're doing. But if you have any questions, it's better to look at it early than, 2 plans later, spending tons of money and going down a road. You're like, why am I ever driven on this road?
Once the cows have left the barn, it's hard to get them back in.
Right. And so the same holds true with the plan. So the return to work plan, like I said, if you were not included in that collaboration process to begin with, the counselor used to be able to, after you've had the plan on your desk for 3 weeks, just go say, well, we'll just, the carrier didn't respond, so they're going to slide it in and the carrier is going to approve it. I personally, if I have any money being spent out of pocket, I want to be sure that I have a carrier signature in support of my plan before I start doing it. But I'm not everyone. And so I think it's important to look at them. Again, same thing. If you think that when we went through that hierarchy of services and you're like, why are we doing, a $30,000 academic program when I think they can become a medical assistant through, Northwestern Career Center? And you may not know all that, but you certainly want to have it addressed as to why short-term training wasn't addressed before an academic program was, considered.
So we wanted to give you an update on closure. These codes are not listed in the hierarchy or in the statutes, but they are relevant. You're going to see when a counselor files a closure of VR5, they have to list the closure code. And so we can provide you with those if you want a written copy of those, but you need to look at that. And one of the things that there was some discussion about this, I'll ask Fran's opinion too. Some counselors will file and say someone's not entitled because their disability is too severe. I personally feel that that is exactly the person who should be entitled. Even if you feel like you can't get them back to work, they should be entitled. And then if you're going to conclude that the disability is too severe for them to return to work, then you should file a closure that states that is disability code or a closure code 7. I feel like that's kind of a wishy-washy way to do it, is to say they're not entitled. And plus, it's an abdication of our responsibility to injured workers. The people who require the most services are the people who are most severely disabled. And so when a filing like that is made, that places you at significant risk for a potential permanent total. So if you see something like that, you may want to question it.
Right. I don't mean to interrupt, but I think if you see that code, you can object to a closure as well, because you might say, it may have first come across your desk and you're like, great, Voc Rehab's all closed. But trust me, the cost associated with the perm total versus continued Voc Rehab is substantially different. So, and you want to be sure that all avenues for Voc Rehab services were pursued before you go down that avenue of the disability too severe. That's why I think it is, in my opinion, it is like John's. I feel it is a mistake to file them as not entitled. It's different than eligible. We're doing entitlement, and the state system is eligible. And I sometimes think, counselors that come from a different background, look at things differently. We're looking at do they have the skills to go back to, work that they have prior training or experiences? You're looking at the skills and the capacity. And if they don't, they're entitled.
Now, another issue that comes up on closure is employability versus employment. And now, typically, the interpretation is that a case cannot be closed successfully unless someone is actually employed. Now, I've had other cases where I've consulted with the injured worker, with the carrier, with the employer, and we've all agreed that the person is employable even if they can't go back to their usual job. But I wouldn't file a closure unless all parties were in agreement on an issue like that. For example, I had a client who took the assessment of prior learning class at CCV and accumulated enough to have an associate's degree. Was not quite at medical end, so final work capacity had not been established and he had not gone back to work, but we all agreed that he was employable. And so I filed the closure on that basis. Closure for lack of cooperation requires that the file be well documented. The counselor should have submitted many job leads, demonstrated that the client has received assistance in applying for jobs. So you have to have at least 3 letters saying, hey, I expect you to do this, this, and this, or otherwise outline specific incidents where they failed to cooperate. Sometimes they just disappear,
Right. Or they don't respond. Like
Yeah.
you've sent 5 letters out and they just don't respond, but you at a minimum, even if you can't get in touch with them, you have to send 3 letters, snail mail, along with all the emails and texts and however other methods you have for contacting them.
I think Fran would agree with this, but both of us, we try our best not to just close somebody up. If we can get somebody to say, I'm not interested in voc rehab, then we might send them a letter and get them to agree to sign off on that. Well, that's a much better outcome than, an adversarial failure to comply.
Right.
If it's their decision, you know what, I'm close to retirement, I really don't want voc rehab. If I can get them to sign off, that's a much better outcome.
Right. Okay, and then this is just sort of the last. I think both John and I will go. Actually, John will cover this, but I think at this point, we went over a little bit about an independent vocational evaluation, and John's going to go over the difference between that and vocational assessment.
Right, an independent vocational evaluation typically looks at a plan or an entitlement assessment that's been submitted under the statutory guidelines and determines whether the services that are being provided in the case of a plan are reasonable and necessary, or whether the entitlement is consistent with the statutory guidelines. A vocational assessment, typically we file when there's a question of permanent total. There may be other issues, but typically it's permanent total disability. And in those cases, we use a methodology that's designed to assess whether someone's capable of returning to regular gainful employment, which is a different standard than what we look for in voc rehab, which is suitable employment. That is reasonably or as close as possible to 100% of the prior wage, physically suitable, etc. When we're talking about regular gainful employment, it should be employment that is consistent with what SSA might call substantial gainful activity. That is, it's uninterrupted work. That is in terms of unscheduled absences or ability to attend to tasks.
Has to exist in the labor market.
Right, and the other standard it cannot be charitable employment. So that would not constitute regular gainful work. You'll see either one of us would be happy to send you a redacted report showing you how we conduct those assessments of permanent total disability, or an IVE for that matter.
Right, and I think
we're closing in on the end of and we don't want to keep you over. So the VR8 is the counselor choice.
Right, and I think that we went in the beginning, I think if you have the ability to work with the opposing attorney, that it's a really good idea to find a counselor that is acceptable on both sides. There's definitely individuals out there most attorneys are willing to work with, so I would start there. But when the VR8 comes, that's when you're gonna have, and if it goes to, someone that's sometimes where you may have to pay more attention to the case. I'm not trying to say it in a, but I think that there are cases you want to sort of pay attention to as far as the plan and all the rest of that.
And we talked a little bit about the PTD claims, which we have to go by the odd lot doctrine. And what that means is if someone comes to the table and they don't speak English, or they have some other impairment, but they were hired by that employer, we still have to take that into account when we assess the capacity to return to regular gainful employment, even if it's not related to the work injury. Okay.
Right. So if they've had diabetes, a heart condition, or some other, or, deafness, blindness, if they have some other medical condition that impacts their ability to work, and then they get a work-related injury, we have to look at the entire person, not just what was caused by the work-related accident.
Right. I mean, as voc rehab counselors, that's what we do anyway. We look at the whole person. Now, our focus is directed to return to work, but we still have to evaluate the whole person as we work with somebody.
Right.
And we talked about regular gainful work. Here's our contact information.
Yeah, and I want to encourage you, if you have any questions, I mean, this is the unfortunate part of doing all this virtually, is that we can't answer them, but we will try to be present when you're listening to this, and feel free to contact either one of us on email or phone or cell, and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, even if you don't have, even if you're not formally referring a case to us, if you have a question about voc rehab, by all means, just give us a call. We have, between us, we have over 50 years, over almost
probably 60 I
years
have 30,
experience.
so yeah.
Yeah, and I have 27, so 28 now. Oh my
Right.
God. Well, anyway, we have a lot of experience in Vermont. And we'll be happy to talk with you about any issues that may come up.
Right. So, all right. Well, have a great afternoon.
Thanks a lot. Did that save? If I have to do this again, I'm gonna.
Where is it saved?
Stop share. Bye, everybody. And pause, stop